Hello. The last time I spoke at DDD EU, 50% of my talk's feedback was about my mic being too loud. So I'm asking you, is it okay? Yes. Perfect. I'm going to talk about domain-driven design, but I'm going to put it into the socio-technical context. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect at FlixBus. I'm already working there for almost 6 years, so quite some time. I experienced a lot of pain while scaling the company, and I applied a lot of patterns that I will talk about here directly in my organization. Okay. This is an environmental orb. Does somebody know what this thing is doing? No. So this thing hooks into the energy consumption of your digitally wired home and basically gets a different color depending on how good or bad the energy consumption in the household is, right? So what happened when they installed it is when they measured that they got a 40% reduction of energy consumption in households where these orbs were installed. So it's a perfect example of how socio-technical systems work, right? When you talk to people about organizations and software and how they're interrelated, there's one thing you hear all the time. It's this one, Conway's Law. Who has heard it before? Yeah, I thought so. I'm not going to repeat it because, in my opinion, it's only one part of the story. When this law was formulated, that was 50 years ago, software development and software architecture and software itself was very different from what it was today. What I think is happening is we have something, we have a purpose, be it an organization's purpose, it might also be your personal purpose. When we talk about the environmental orb, then you do something in your household, you do something that you want to do. And we have two things. One is the work systems, the organization design, how people organize themselves to fulfill something they want. And on the other hand, we have the information systems, right? They are driven by the software design. What happens now is that the work system influences the information system, so the organization design influences the software design. So what it does is the existing communication structures inside that system and the success and the failure of previous adaptations and the organizational design itself, they affect the software design pretty much. And on the other hand, software has evolved from 50 years ago. Right now, technology mediates actually social interactions, right? Think about customer support live chats. Think about notifications. Think about alarms. So you're changing the communication structures of the work system, which then again feeds back into the software design, right? So what we have is basically a socio-technical feedback loop. This is a never-ending story. If somebody wants to sell you some agile transformation, which is budgeted for 3 years and then they're done, I would be very wary about that. Because you're never done. It will always go on and on and on. So organizations are interdependent. So, right, there is not a single socio-technical system. They are living in other systems. So basically what they are is that they are networks. So the parts are interdependent. The communication between these subsystems, they happen at the boundaries. And it's really important to understand that the boundaries is a really, really important concept. And another thing is that very small, tiny changes in a subsystem can have a very profound effect, positive and negative, on the organization's ability to achieve its purpose. Your organization chart is not the reality. Just because on some paper in your organization there is a hierarchical structure with VPs and C-level executives, and then some team leads, and then maybe some developers and some business people, it's not the reality. It will never capture the diagonal and horizontal communication structures that actually evolve naturally in networks. So our job is to uncover this organizational reality. So we cannot think about the organization of people and the software systems in isolation. And as Nick Tune said, they are symbiotic, and I like that because it gives a reference to something that is living, right? That is never, stopping, never static, that's always evolving. So when we talk about socio-technical design, what are actually the concerns that we're dealing with, right? So this is just a short list. So the first thing we're dealing with is finding cohesion in the model, in the boundaries, in the semantics of the system. So letting the system match its objective. Another one is alignment. So letting the people have ownership of outcomes that are somehow aligned with the business goals. Autonomy, let those who have the problem actually figure it out, right? So not somebody comes with, we want to have this feature set, please deliver it in 3 months' time, this is the budget, right? We want to have problems, we want to solve problems and explore the solution space ourselves. The culture, so letting people learn, choose, also openly feel and belong to the organization. This sounds very easy, but I think it's the hardest part, actually, when we do social technical design, dealing with people and how they feel, their emotions. Flexibility. So specialization will precede extinction. If we want to change courses, and this will happen, because the environment has different pressures on the system, then we need to be flexible and be able to steer in a different direction. The boundary innovation, right? I talked about the importance of the boundaries. Because magic happens when different groups of people meet. If you heard Alberto's talk, you probably heard a lot of examples about that. And it's really important to do that. Transparency. So giving information first to those who are affected by it, and then to everyone. So imagine this situation, right? So you're dissolving a team because a product reached its end of life, and these people are probably, they need to decide where they want to go, what they want to do in their organization now. Imagine you don't talk to these people, but you just announce it at a global all hands or something like that. How do you think these people will feel? They would probably be very, very disappointed. Evolution. So we need to be able to evolve our socio-technical system in a certain direction. And when I talk about evolution, I mean guided evolution, right? Because evolution can also go wrong. A lot of times, evolution goes wrong. And the leadership. If a general takes an axe, his soldiers will loot a village. It's the same. When you try to apply this full concept, you need to have the backing by the leadership, and they need to support you as well. Otherwise, you will not be able to change the organization in the scope of all these categories. And the last one now, this is my mantra. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. The social impact of these changes can be immense, right? It's not just a commit that you push and then you revert it. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with the organizational structures. The effects can be immense. So we need to think 3 or 4 times before we do something. So we were talking about the organization's purpose, when most of us are working in a for-profit organization. So I would like to know who here works for a non-profit organization? Yeah. I like what you're doing, but most of us work for a for-profit organization, and these organizations have certain needs. And the main need is normally being better than your competitor, either at delivering high-quality goods and services, or you want to engage with the market to detect and understand what customers really want, right? If you are able to deliver 20 features a day that no one wants, then the one who delivers 1 feature per week, but knows exactly what the customer wants, wins. You need some kind of anticipation of the market, compliance, and regulatory changes. So you need to be kind of able to predict where the environment is going. And of course, you need to be, if you anticipated it, you need to be able to adapt to it, right? Be it potential risks, security threats, changing market conditions. And the competition is growing. So in 2017, a book called Accelerate was published. There was a Puppet research on the DevOps report, basically. They were collecting a lot of data from business people in IT, asking them a lot of questions, gathering statistical data, and they were making some analysis. So they were looking at what are high-performing organizations doing and what are low-performing organizations doing. And so this is the distribution. So you see we have 15% low, 37% medium, 48% high, 7% elite. This is a new one in 2018 because, as I said, it never stops. It always goes forward. It always gets better, faster. You know, faster horses. One important thing, one important measure and metric is the lead time. The time from the idea of something until it's going into production, right? So this is one very important metric. And they were measuring the gap between the low-performing organizations and the high-performing organizations. So in 2017, the high performers were 440 times faster in delivery than the low performers. So in 2018, anybody here wants to guess the number? If you know it, please don't spoil it. Anybody wants to guess? 2,000. Close? I think that's a mind-boggling number, to be honest. Some organizations are 2,555 times faster in delivering the features than the low-performing organizations. So what did they find? What had the strongest correlation to being a high-performing organization? And it was this. Loosely coupled architectures and teams are the strongest predictors of continuous delivery, right? It's not just about the architecture. It's also about the people, the teams who built the software. And if we look into the blue book, into Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software by Eric Evans, strategic design principles must guide design decisions to reduce the interdependence of parts. So strategic domain-driven design is an extremely helpful heuristic for socio-technical design. So bounded context, we're going to revisit. We have heard about it before. So on one hand, it's using language as a heuristic to conceptually separate different parts of the domain that are potentially ambiguous, right? And it also identifies cohesive parts of the domain that have the same reason for change, right? So within the bounded context, the reasons for change are very similar in comparison to other bounded contexts. So the assumption is if we align team boundaries with bounded contexts, we assume that the team autonomy is increased and less work will need to be coordinated between the teams, right? So let's put that to a test. So let's align teams with technical capabilities. So let's do the opposite. So we have a UX front-end team. It has a average delivery time of 2 days. Then we have a back-end team, the average delivery time of 2 weeks. And then we have the DBAs who care about this monolithic database, and every single change needs to be, looked at from all different angles. Performance has to be kept stable. They have an average delivery time of 2 months. So let's put a bounded context over that, right? So bounded context, meaningful features, they touch all technical layers, right? There is normally not just a UX feature. I mean, sometimes there are, but if it's really meaningful, then it's touching all the technical layers. So what does it mean? It requires constant coordination for everything between those 3 teams. Additionally, you're constrained by the weakest link, right? The bottleneck. So what's the best case scenario? Every feature will take on average 2 months, right? Because the slowest team sets the pace. So as long as dependencies exist between teams that need high collaboration, the slowest moving team will always be the bottleneck, right? And it will limit the overall throughput for the other teams. So what will happen? They will say, okay, we're blocked. We're going to start something new. So they're blocked again. So imagine the work in progress for the other teams, right? You will have a huge backlog of items that you have started, but you cannot finish because the one bottleneck team is not able to deliver anything. So let's take it again to the other side. Right now we have beautiful bounded contexts. We have a layered architecture. We have nice boundaries, right? We have the search context, a checkout context, and a payment context. They're really isolated, autonomous. And now we're running for 3 months and 6 months. And then what we realize, suddenly, whoops, there's still bottlenecks. Why? We did everything right. We have nice boundaries. We put team autonomy there. So why is the delivery still slow? Because verticals are no silver bullet. Just relying on verticals aligned with bounded context is not enough. Sometimes even with these bottlenecks, with these verticals, bottlenecks arise. So we need some additional heuristics, right? We need to understand how these bounded contexts interact. What are their relationships to each other? So what do you do? Imagine you wanted to go to DDD EU, and the Uber/cab driver dropped you off at the completely other end of Amsterdam. What are you going to do? Call a cab? I would look at Google Maps to look where I am. So mapping the actual situation, understanding where you are, is a really, really great way to get some understanding of the relationships. So we're going to map out the contexts. And again, Eric Evans gives us a good quote here, which says, even when boundaries are clear, relationships with other contexts place constraints on the nature of the model, right? And these constraints, they manifest themselves primarily through non-technical channels. What he means is actually people. People that build the software, teams that are doing it. So here is an example of a context map from our organization. It's just a part. Our system is pretty complicated, but I have reduced it to a bit of, to have you understand it a bit. So we have the revenue management subdomain, which is taking care of pricing and revenue analysis, and we have e-commerce. We have some order processing. We have an external PSP, and we have the market definitions, which gives some information about, okay, where am I? What is the market strategy that we're having here? And we put the different contexts now in relation to each other. So the direction of the arrows means that there is an upstream and a downstream team, right? So the arrows always flow downstream, right? Like a river, always downstream. And we annotated it with certain classifications of these relationships. And we will go through some of them to understand what they actually mean, and also what they actually mean in the socio-technical context, right? What kind of organizational patterns can you apply to solve these kind of relationships and solve these kind of dependencies? So the first one that we saw is subdomains, right? So what are subdomains? Subdomains represent really cohesive boundaries in your domain. It's like the big stuff, you know, the big concepts. There might be a lot of bounded contexts within a subdomain. But they normally change together, right? So you probably, when you align the team boundaries around them, you probably have some cohesive strategy. Unfortunately, the size and the complexity of these subdomains can vary greatly, right? So sometimes the one-to-one mapping is not possible between a subdomain and a team. Okay, what we do else? So we saw here, we have a partnership between the price calculation and the revenue analysis, which makes sense because they feed into each other. They're planning together. So when teams in two contexts will succeed or fail together, right? So one cannot live with the other. A cooperative relationship often emerges. And there is a socio-technical pattern, and you probably heard it. So layer 2 capability, so a layer above that. It's something like a tribe or community of practice. So in the Spotify model, it's called tribe. For us, it's called community of practice. So basically what it does, it gives this collaboration and coordination between these teams an organizational setting, right? So the organization knows, hey, these two teams are working together. We apply a certain budget for them to meet. We apply a certain budget for them to collaborate. They know each other very well. So it's important that the organization supports it. It's important that it's explicit, that it's not just some implicit collaboration. Another one is the shared kernel. So what is the shared kernel? So sometimes sharing a part of the model and the associated code is a very intimate interdependency, which can either leverage or undermine it, right? So in our case, the market definitions are used by all the other teams, by all the other contexts. The information is ubiquitous. It's needed everywhere. And what kind of socio-technical pattern can you apply here? And what we did is using inner sourcing. So what you do is you take the open source processes and apply them to a code base within your organization, right? You separate the contributors from the actual committers. You have a code review process. And this way, you guarantee the quality because you need to make sure that this shared kernel stays crisp and small and only really necessary things go in. There's also something like an open host service published language, right? So imagine you have a service or a team or a system, and this system needs to be integrated by a lot of other systems, right? There is a lot of dependencies. So when a subsystem needs to be integrated with all of these systems, you rely on certain protocols, right? You have a specification of the protocol, and other people are going to adhere to that. So what we do in this case is we're doing internal RFCs. So each of these protocols will go into the complete organization in order to gather feedback early in the design process. Because fixing these protocols early in the design process is much less costly than developing the protocols just to realize that some team downstream may have a problem with that. Actually, Uber is doing that. I think they have around 5,000 engineers or something. So Uber, every design choice they do, they play that to 5,000 engineers. So it works. And for us as well. Another possibility is that you employ cross-team pairing, cross-team mobbing with the upstream and downstream teams, right? So if those teams come together to actually work on the protocol, then the knowledge of the design of the specification will be early distributed. And feedback will be there very, very early in the design process. There's other things that you can use as a heuristic. User journeys, for example, right? So user journey most of the time is too large for a single team. You can also align them inside the user journey and attach them to different teams and choose the team boundaries around a certain context in the user journey. The problem that you get is that UX consistency will be very, very hard to achieve without a lot of collaboration. Running experiments, for example, over the multiple contexts, also a really, really big challenge. End-to-end test scenarios, right? All the three teams would have to constantly collaborate and coordinate. Okay, what is actually the test scenarios? What kind of test data do we need for that? So it's a very, very challenging thing. And there is a pattern to apply here, which is called centralized partnership. It's coming from Peter Meerholz and Kristen Skinner that have written the book Org Design for Design Orgs, where you have a team that is actually responsible for the UX. Here in this example, the e-commerce UX, and is actually facilitating the collaboration on running experiments. How do we test it? How do we guarantee the UX consistency? How do we make sure that the teams are deploying consistent stuff? So this is a pattern that you could apply there. Business processes is also a valid approach, right? So sometimes the business process is very stable and only the individual parts in it change very dramatically. Then it makes sense to align the team boundaries around the individual process steps. But what if everything comes together? So in this example, we have domains, we have contexts, we have a user journey, and we have a business process. Everything is interrelated. So what we do now You cannot say, I choose this over that, because you may affect something, the other context there. So we need some additional heuristics. So, for example, there could be technical constraints, right? How easy is it actually to implement? Or it could be the team size, the team location, the team maturity. Are they actually able to pull it off? Again, UX consistency is also something. If you are a very customer-driven organization, then UX consistency, conversion rates, all these kind of things have a very, very profound effect on your revenue stream. So you want to make sure that these are all in order. The relevance, right? So it could be a core, like core to your domain, very important. Or it could be something generic, where you would say, okay, this investment is not enough to justify that. Or the domain expert allocation, for example. So imagine that for some parts of the user journey, there is a certain domain expert who speaks the domain language. Then it might make sense to say, okay, if this domain expert is responsible for these contexts, why not just put them together to a single team? Because the domain expert basically gives the semantics, gives the meanings there. These are all different heuristics that you could apply if something like that happens, right? If you are not sure which of these patterns you should take now. So, some last words. This was all very easy because it's clean, there's some nice context, and you have a process. What if you are in a really messy situation, right? You have a legacy system to deal with. And this is not an easy task. It's something where bounded contexts may overlap a lot of different of these map items that you have identified. And to be honest, there is no easy solution to that. The only solution to that is to accept that it's messy and that to try to make it better item by item, to identify what is the most important, what is the most valuable piece that I want to, clean up, that I want to extract, that I want to, make flexible, right? Make adaptable. Where does the flexibility give me the greatest value? I think I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.